Hi, everyone. Welcome to Heart Rhythm Society TV. This is Jeanne Poole. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Heart Rhythm O2 Journal, and I'm very excited for this interview today. Today, I have with me Dr. Marye Gleva, professor of medicine and an associate editor for the journal. She is a cardiac electrophysiologist at Washington University in St. Louis. And our special guest, longtime dear friend and colleague, Chuck Swerdlow. Also, of course, everybody knows cardiac EP. He is a professor of medicine at Cedars-Sinai and clinical professor of medicine at UCLA. And before we get into his really interesting paper that I'm going to let Marye sort of run the whole interview part of this, I just wanted to take a moment myself to recognize Chuck's enormous contributions to our field. And he is definitely very unique. He has filled an important niche. He is the one that really understands the nitty-gritty of device design, and especially lead design, as well as algorithms. He was pivotal in the design of the Medtronic lead integrity alert algorithm, has published widely on these topics. And whenever clinically any of us have a question about the electrogram troubleshooting, he is our go-to guy. And so I just really am thankful, Chuck, that you can be with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marye to start chatting with you about this paper that you have submitted and published and is available now online in HRO2.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeanne, and I second the welcome to everyone. You know, understanding electrograms in our CIED patients is so integral to appropriate quality patient management. And I think Chuck's contribution to this field is bar none outstanding, and this paper is going to help us get some other insight into lead management. Our patients are living longer, these leads are in longer, and so we need to know how to do these things. So the paper that we're discussing today is the time course of oversensing and impedance changes in developing an ICD lead fracture. And this is an in vivo study. So Chuck, let's start off by having you tell us what made you do this? What was your unanswered question? You're the lead expert. How can you have an unanswered question?
Well, Marye and Jeanne, thank you for the very kind words. To provide a little context, historically, the primary diagnostic we've used to identify lead conductor fractures has been an out-of-range impedance for more than 40 years. But more than a decade ago, especially when recalled Fidelis leads began to fracture, the most common clinical presentation was inappropriate shocks caused by rapid oversensing without impedance alerts. And soon it became clear that this pattern of presentation of pace-sense lead fractures with shocks and no impedance alerts was common to most defibrillator leads. But from an engineering perspective, we know that any fracture has to increase impedance because for any given medical conductor, what's constant is resistivity or impedance per cross-sectional area. And so when we reduce the cross-sectional area with a fracture, the impedance has to go up. And this apparent paradox came alive for me a number of years ago when we extracted the lead shown in this first slide, which presented with rapid oversensing typical of lead fracture. And you can see in the top left panel, there is just a completely normal impedance trend. But when we took the lead out, you can see that the conductor coil to the tip electrode was separated completely under the plastic. And in fact, when we took the plastic off to see it better and melted the plastic away, the coil completely separated. So I wanted to understand, how could the resistance be completely normal when the conductor is completely broken? And so my colleagues and I performed this in vitro study for two reasons. First, to answer the question, what's the structural state of a fractured lead when alerts are triggered, either oversensing alerts or impedance alerts? And secondly, how can we use what we learn to design better device lead diagnostics and to improve how leads are tested preclinically?
Okay, great. So let's move on to your experimental setup. And it's quite detailed. So can you just give us an overview of how you designed this experiment and some of the unique characteristics that you built into the methods to answer these questions?
Yeah, thank you, Marye. So first, let me briefly address why we didn't actually know the answers to these questions after using diagnostics for so many years. And the answer to that lies in how leads are, how conductors are tested preclinically. Preclinically, conductors are generally tested in air, so the fracture-induced oversensing signals can't be recorded. They're tested on little segments of conductor rather than complete leads, so you can't attach them to a defibrillator to see what the diagnostics are. And then finally, they're tested until the conductor is completely broken, so that the impedance correlates of a partial fracture can't be determined. Now, to overcome these limitations, let me refer to the slide that's up now, which is figure 1 in our paper. To overcome these limitations, we waterproof the apparatus, testing apparatus to bend leads, and then we tested the entire lead, not just a little segment of conductor, and then we connected it to the ICD generator so we could record telemetered signals. And then we dunked the whole thing in a saline bath, and that permitted us to both input simulated ECG signals and to record fracture-induced signals. And then finally, we measured electrical resistance extremely precisely. And so in this diagram, in this figure, you can see these are the plates that bend the lead. This is the lead segment stuck in the bending plates. It's attached to the defibrillator over here. We telemeter the signals to a recording apparatus that's not shown in this picture. And then we have big patch electrodes on the side to put in simulated ECG signals. And that's the general outline of our experiment. And of course, we have high precision probes to measure resistance to high levels of accuracy.
Wow, that's quite detailed and kind of addresses the issues that you wanted to. So thank you for going through that with us. Can you talk us through your results for both the ring cable electrode and the conductor coil electrode?
Yes. This slide shows figure 6 in our manuscript, which summarizes the sequence of structural sensing electrogram changes, impedance changes, and development of inappropriate shocks as fractures develop for both the cable conductor that goes to the ring electrode and the helical coil that goes to the tip electrode. If we start at the top left in panel A, we can see that shows a partial fracture of just a few of the 49 filars of the cable electrode, and 3 of the 4 major manufacturers use 49 filar cable electrodes. And we can see that there are very subtle changes as impedance. I'll show you a flat baseline in another slide, but these changes peak to trough are only 6/1000ths of an ohm. They're just not measurable or even conceivable that we could get close to them in a clinical test. And we can see, however, that there's absolutely no oversensing. These signals here, this is the pace sense signal, and this is the input electrogram that simulates an ECG at 60 beats a minute or 1 hertz. This is our first sign of oversensing. And you can see that on the marker channel with the rapid markers and these very low amplitude, discrete, abnormal signals. And you can see that while it's very hard to see on a standard photomicrograph that the cable is completely fractured, that when we look at it under electron microscopy, you can see it is, when we blow it up, higher resolution light microscopy, you can see that it's completely fractured. On the other hand, the baseline impedance is completely unchanged around 15 ohms, and the maximum increase, with a bending cycle is only about 30 ohms, and most of them much smaller.
Yes.
But in fact, this can progress, the oversensing can progress to device-detected ventricular fibrillation and inappropriate shocks before impedance alerts are triggered, typically by 1,500 or 2,000 ohm measures of impedance. Now, there are similarities and differences for conductor coils. The biggest difference between the structural progression and correlates of oversensing and impedance changes relate to partial fractures. With conductor coils, there are also small cyclical changes with the bending cycle, with the bending frequency, which is a little faster than the electrogram frequency. It's 1.3 hertz. But we can see that when there is a partial fracture, and here you can see 2 of the 4 filars of this conductor coil are fractured, that there are oversensing signals that occur in time cyclically with the impedance changes in the bending cycle. And I'm going to come back to this point. However, and similar to the ring cable, this can progress to more frequent oversensing and inappropriate detection of VF by the device, even with a normal impedance. And in fact, it is not until the lead completely fractured, not until the coil completely fractures. And when the coil does fracture, it separates, that we get an impedance alert. So for both conductors, impedance alerts correlate with complete separation of the conductor, but oversensing alerts occur much earlier. I'd like to move on to another finding we had, and that is that when we ended the test at impedances of 3,000 ohms, that we found some very interesting changes in the electrical signals. On the left side, we see a conductor coil, and we see it as the test is approaching its end. The first time we get to an impedance of 3,000 ohms, our computer-controlled apparatus automatically turned off the bending. And you can see what happens to the oversensing. The oversensing signal here, which looks pretty much like what textbook oversensing and lead fracture looks like, stops as soon as the bending stops. Similarly, for the ring cable, and you can see that the ends are separated and broken here completely, we get this 3,000 ohm impedance spike with a bending cycle. We shut off the bending, and the electrogram again normalizes. So an important point is that unless the fracture ends are bending, you won't get abnormal electrograms. Finally, I would like to come back to one point I touched on earlier, but kind of develop it a little bit. And this is the point that oversensing correlates very directly with pacing-induced peaks in impedance, even though they're very small. And if we look at the present slide, and if we start with panel A, and this is a figure 3 from our paper that shows the progressive sequence of changes for a conductor coil fracture, and in our paper, panel 4 shows the same findings for a cable fracture, but we can see what a baseline electrogram looks like. We can see there are just extremely tiny changes with each flex cycle on the impedance tracing, and that the electrogram is completely clean. We can see a change in the frequency of sensed events on the marker channel, and when oversensing starts, it has not only the same temporal frequency as the bending cycles, but it actually has exactly the same shape. You see this little double peak shape on both the electrograms and on the impedance changes. And this tells us that, or at least this is, I think, the strongest evidence we have supporting the underlying conjecture that's been around for a long time, that so-called make-break potentials, potentials that arise between fracture faces as the faces oppose and then come apart at different parts of the bending cycle, are the root cause of fracture-induced oversensing, also explaining why in some leads that these electrograms stop when you stop bending the lead. And I think I'll stop there for the key experimental findings.
Well, that's great. These are really detailed figures that I think have a lot of information, and I encourage all of our audience to take a look at the paper and kind of look through this carefully. It's very detailed, thorough work. So let's move to the clinical implications of this, and I think you just alluded to it. So tell me, when you see this now, what would you recommend to, junior attendings and people starting out? What should we do when we start seeing the electrograms in panel B?
Right.
For example.
So let me just take a little bit of a bigger picture, which is that progressive changes to electrograms, for example, even down in panel E in this panel where we have an oversensing alert, can occur with virtually no changes. In fact, virtually clinically no measured changes in impedance. So I think one key takeaway message that we've learned the hard way over the years, but that this paper provides the mechanistic support for an approach that says we should replace leads at the first sign of fracture-induced oversensing. Now, of course, the point you made is that implicitly is that before replacing a lead, it's essential that we understand and confirm that the electrograms really are characteristic of fractures rather than some other cause of oversensing, such as electromagnetic interference or diaphragmatic myopotentials.
Right.
And that discussion is something that that Dr. Poole and I and others have contributed to over the years of how to identify these electrograms, and I think a bit beyond the scope of this paper. But the point is, there is an extensive literature on how to separate fracture-induced electrogram abnormalities from other types, and when that happens, we should not wait for impedance alerts.
Yes. Okay.
A converse, so I just like to make two other points very briefly. A converse point is that an out-of-range pacing impedance alone, if there is no oversensing and you have a device that can record oversensing, rarely indicates a conductor fracture, because conductor fractures are so closely associated with oversensing, at least pace sense conductor fractures. High voltage conductor fractures are another issue. And then finally, as you pointed out, these electrograms in panel B are not the ones that we are used to thinking about, that the earliest abnormalities in a lead fracture are discrete, limited oversensing electrogram changes that aren't the ones we see in textbooks that looked characteristically so-called noisy. And so while these are not necessarily specific, they should at least raise a suspicion for enhanced monitoring so that we can keep an eye on that lead for progression of any changes that we can be certain are due to lead fracture. And by doing that, we may improve our ability to identify electrogram characteristics that distinguish lead fracture. So I think those are our key clinical findings, or key clinical implications, sorry.
All right, thank you. And just to sum it up here, do you think that this is going to contribute to newer evolutions of lead monitoring algorithms? Do you anticipate seeing that? I would guess somebody would be able to then take a look at these patterns and frequencies and coupling intervals, if you will, and cyclic versus non-cyclic, and come up with a way to maybe through machine learning to get these patterns and help us sort the early oversensing out. What do you think it's going to do to the lead monitoring algorithms that we have?
Well, I think there are two implications of our paper for lead monitoring algorithms that are quite straightforward and mercifully don't require machine learning or anything computationally intense and could be implemented in present day leads. The first observation we have is that the distinguishing characteristic of an early lead fracture is not sustained elevations in impedance, which you can identify by, which is what you might be able to identify by a single measurement of impedance taken, say, every so many hours like we do currently, but rather short-term variability in impedance. So instead of making one measurement an hour or one measurement every number of hours, depending on which company, if we made a series of measurements, and for example, in our study, we made 500 measurements every 3 minutes, and we did it over 7 seconds. So there were, more than 60 measurements a second, so that we could get a pattern like this. And it would not be hard to make rapid measurements of impedance and come up with a measure of variability. The measure we use is standard deviation, but they're computationally simpler measurements that could easily be implemented in a defibrillator. The second implication is that it would be great to have a more precise measurement of impedance in our devices. Now, our devices already measure shock impedance to plus minus 1 ohms, or even a little better in some devices. But there's no defibrillator that measures patient impedance to an error of less than 10 ohms. So it's clearly very possible, since we already do it, to measure plus or minus 1 ohms. And I think combining more precise measurements with repetitive measurements and taking a measurement of variability would likely help us identify fractures at an earlier stage.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for this detailed insight and the clinical translation approach to this. I imagine hitting the measure impedance button a few times more in clinic on leads that we're concerned about. And Jeannie, would you like to offer some concluding remarks and other insights into this?
Well, I can't ever offer any insights compared to Chuck, but I just want to thank both of you so much for taking the time out of your busy days to do this interview. I hope that our readers and watchers will also appreciate the significance of this article, and it'll be added to the group of articles that are really practice changing that Chuck has been the author of, along with some other folks around the nation that are also super smart in these fields. And it's just really fascinating to continue to dig into this topic. And so Chuck, thank you once again for your contribution and for your paper, and I encourage everybody to read the paper and see this interview. Thanks everybody for your time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to explain my paper, and also for the very kind words.
Well, we're just thrilled that you were able to walk us through all of this. So thank you to Heart Rhythm, and we hope to see everybody back for another event on Heart Rhythm TV at some point.
Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.